You are now listening to a podcast made in collaboration with the Copenhagen College Radio.
Hey everybody, welcome to episode 31 of the Social Media and Politics podcast, bringing you expert insights into how social media is changing the political game. I'm your host, Michael Bassetta, political scientist at the University of Copenhagen. Remember that you can follow us on Twitter at SMNP Podcast and check out our Facebook page, facebook.com/Social Media and Politics Podcast. All right, as you may or may not be able to hear, I had a bit of a long night last night, but I still wanted to get behind the mic and get this episode out to you guys on Sunday. I've been trying to keep up a weekly release schedule that's proven a little bit difficult in the summer in terms of getting guests. They're on vacation. They're not answering their emails. They're with their families. Totally fine. But what I wanted to say is that I've got a couple interviews lined up. I'm going to keep trying to hit that weekly release schedule. And what's motivating me to do that and track people down during their summer vacations is you guys and your interest. A couple weeks ago, we passed 15,000 downloads from over 100 different countries, which, first of all, boggles my mind. But second of all, makes me very humbled and appreciative that there are people tuning into the podcast regularly. And I just wanted to show some appreciation for that. I really enjoy it. And it motivates me to continue on recording these conversations that I think are important and of the public concern. So without further ado, let's hop right into it and talk about this episode, which is all about deliberative democracy and how that's being enacted in online spaces. So a little bit of foregrounding. There's been a recent push, and recent, I'm talking like 1980s, 1990s, of political theorists to conceptualize democracy, or at least judge the health of a democracy by the extent to which citizens get together and have informed civil debate around an issue of public concern. So let's take a trending topic, which is healthcare. And, how democratic is that when Republicans are trying to jam that legislation through the House or the Senate? And, we really don't know what the replace aspect is, but we know that they want to repeal. I would say this is not necessarily a mark of deliberative democracy. The legislators themselves are not deliberating about how is the best way to move forward. And I'm not trying to make a political statement, but what I'm saying is political theorists, at least in academia, would say that the health of a democracy is decided by the amount of public debate by citizens who bring their informed opinions to the table and discuss the possible options. They're open to listening to the alternative perspective, even changing their own perspectives about what they think is the best measure to go forward. And that essentially has become the hallmark of democracy, at least in the academic ideal type of thinking about democracy. But I think it's important to state and to remember that democracy isn't really a thing. It's what we make of it. So what academics think democracy is, or what they try to make democracy as, doesn't necessarily align with the way things are. And I think today, the political climate across many established democracies would be more characterized as polarization. And polarization is a buzzword that's been thrown around a lot in the media and in the political discourse. But just to give you an idea of what polarization is, it's the idea that citizens are unwilling to compromise, that they're so extreme in their opinions that they will not listen to the other side. And this is bad for deliberative democracy, which is fundamentally about arguing and getting into informed debate and ultimately being willing to meet in the middle somewhere. And we don't have that right now in the States. And this is not to say that we don't have democracy, but it's to say that we might have a different type of democracy. So deliberative democracy is one ideal, but there's many others that recently has been put forth in different theories in academia, one of which is communitarianism. So communitarianism is the idea that people identify with each other, they trust each other, and they're willing to work together for their agenda. So we do have that in the States. We do have Republicans working for their agenda. We do have Democrats working for their agenda, but it's not being done in a deliberative manner. So all in all, the point is that there's been a push in academia to judge democracy by the extent to which citizens engage in informed debate. And on the other hand, I think we have to take into account the realities of today, which are people are very polarized. They're not willing to compromise and take in others' opinions. So that's basically the climate. Like, we can think about what democracy is, but the other hand is, how is democracy actually being enacted? And there's a very interesting intervening variable there, which is the internet. It facilitates communication among strangers who wouldn't have known each other otherwise. So we have this revolution in communication of people who can meet in online forums or on social media, and they can discuss anything they want, but part of that is going to be political. And what's interesting and what research is showing more and more is that if you go to a place that's explicitly about politics, if you go to a forum where people are debating about politics, it's likely to be very polarized. It's likely to be very aggressive and uncivil. People are trolling each other. But if you go to a non-political space like a lifestyle forum or a gardening forum, people with similar interests come together and they do actually decide to take political measures in terms of protests or signing a petition in order to change something that they equally care about. And this is super interesting, I think. If you're a researcher and if you want to find out, what's going on with politics on social media, you would go to the Facebook pages of Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump. But I think what more and more research is showing is that this is not where conducive politics happens. This is not actually where citizens are debating how they can contact their representatives and change legislation that affects their lives. It's actually more in community pages about whatever, lifestyle, entertainment, racing cars. Who knows? This is where citizens are actually more open to taking in diverse opinions based on a shared interest. So what I wanted to do for this episode is invite Dr. Scott Wright to the show. Dr. Wright is an expert who's been looking at online forums and political talk since the very early days of the internet. And Dr. Wright has done a number of studies looking at how the design of a website influences the type of discussion that's going on there. So what is the level of moderation? Can you upvote or downvote? Do these type of features have an effect on the quality of democratic deliberation that's occurring in these online spaces? So in this interview, we talk a lot about what is deliberative democracy, what is the role of moderators, what is the role of people who participate more often in these forums than others who kind of just come in and leave one comment. Do the super participators have a control, whether normative or actual, in terms of deleting comments, in terms of what can online spaces mean for democracy? That's what this episode is all about. That's what this interview is all about. And I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Scott Wright to tell us all about it. My guest today is Dr. Scott Wright, Senior Lecturer in Political Communication at the University of Melbourne. Dr. Wright is one of the world's leading researchers of political talk and online spaces, and he's done extensive research on what citizens' discussions in websites, forums, and social media means for democracy. Dr. Wright, thanks so much for taking the time out, and welcome to the Social Media and Politics podcast.
Well, thank you for having me, Michael.
So let's jump straight out of the gate and foreground our listeners with a little bit of democratic theory. What is meant by deliberative democracy, and why does it matter?
So deliberative democracy is the idea that rather than just having a vote where people say, I want this person or I want that person, which is relatively kind of unreflective and spontaneous. With deliberative democracy, the idea is that people talk about their preferences first, and they can talk with other citizens to try and understand the alternative point of view. So the alternative perspectives on the issue or on an election or whatever it might be, and that they can come to a more informed decision. That can be a kind of collective position where everyone has to agree on a certain policy, or it can just be that they agree to disagree. It matters because arguably one of the issues we have today is polarization in political systems. In America, we have a strongly polarized political environment with the Trump and the right, and then the Democrats on the left, obviously. Similar kinds of situations in Australia. And the idea of deliberative democracy is that this kinds of polarization might, in theory at least, be overcome by getting people to talk to each other, by actually getting people who are from the left to talk with people from the right and to try and understand the alternative person's perspective. And that obviously, I think, is important for the quality of democracy, but it also has an educative role in terms of citizenship and broader civic life too.
Right. And you've been looking at this through what you call everyday political talk on online spaces. So can you tell us what you mean by everyday political talk?
So the idea really is that we've got this kind of idealized model of deliberation. It's informed by theorists like Jürgen Habermas, a famous critical theorist. And that has basically informed most of the kind of academic studies in this area, that citizens are supposed to engage in rational, critical communication. They're supposed to use evidence to support their claims. They're supposed to be polite and so on and so forth. That kind of, elite model of talk is quite exclusionary. It's not the way that most people engage in actual political talk in real life. And so what we've been interested in is literally how people talk about the everyday politics, especially in non-political spaces. So I'll break that into the two parts. Everyday political talk is essentially what people are talking about in their day-to-day lives online. That could be on Facebook, it could be in forums, often not political forums. Most people don't go to political spaces. They're not interested in politics. But they talk about politics all of the time. This can be lived political experiences, not necessarily what the Prime Minister or the President is doing. This is their childcare, their education, healthcare. So that's what we're interested in, is this how people talk about real world politics as experienced by them using, like I would say, a lower level. It's about discourse rather than deliberation. So it's about debate and talk rather than this idea that people have to be, as Stephen Coleman calls it, deliberation is what happens in the senior common room at Oxford and Cambridge, and that can happen, but most people aren't like that.
And throughout your research over the years, you've outlined several factors that can influence political talk, and particularly in different online spaces. And one of the arguments you make is that the design of an online space can influence the quality of deliberation. Can you unpack that argument? What's the importance of a website or a forum's design in influencing political talk?
Well, I would argue that it's extremely important. When I came up with that idea originally, which was probably 10 years ago now, or maybe even 15 years ago now, was my kind of like a light bulb moment, really. Everyone talks about the internet and about these websites in a kind of almost technologically determinist way, that the internet will have this effect on politics. But the reality is, in my view, is that the interface shapes the way people communicate. I'd explain it to you like this. The design of a parliament affects the nature of the debate between the parliamentarians. Consider, for example, the Westminster Parliament in the UK, where you've got the government and the opposition sat directly opposite each other, and they throw arguments and they throw verbal missiles at each other, and it's quite an aggressive, discursive, one side versus the other debate. On the other hand, you get parliaments like, say, the European Parliament, which have a semicircle design. And that creates arguably a more positive discursive space. Yes, of course, they still have their political fights. But in the same way that I argue that the design of a physical space, such as a parliament, affects the way communication occurs, websites are the same. The design of the interface matters. Let me give you some examples of that. For example, whether or not a website has threading, so whether it shows you who is talking to who, affects the way people can interact. Another one is whether or not they have real name identification. Does it tell you who it actually is? That might be they log in with their Facebook account, for example, or is it anonymous? These are all choices. They're all design choices. Anonymity or not is a classic design choice. Are they moderated or not? Or how are they moderated? How does the person who basically monitors the discussion to make sure that people don't swear or engage in trolling or abuse or racism or whatever. How is that designed and instituted? So in that way, design foregrounds and shapes the kinds of political communication that occurs.
And you tested this idea back in 2007 or even earlier on a study that was looking at Usenet and a political EU forum. First of all, can you kind of explain what you were looking at? Like, what is Usenet? I think some of our listeners may be too young to remember this. And this EU forum, what were you looking at there, and kind of what were your conclusions?
So Usenet is an early kind of online forum. This was started, back in the 80s even, Usenet. It's what I guess it often is known in some parts of the world anyway, in China, for example, as a bulletin board system, or BBS. So Usenet was an early standard style threaded discussion forum. A bit like, say, you might go to a football forum or a parenting forum. But Usenet was interesting because it was basically kind of really open to topic, but it was framed. So each board or discussion forum had its own kind of title. So, for example, alt.politics.Clinton or alt.politics.Bush. So it was kind of telling you that this area of the board is for talking about Bill Clinton, as it was back then, or the first George Bush. And that creates, in my mind, an element of polarization and also potentially flaming and trolling, because the people who support Clinton would arguably gravitate towards the Clinton space, but then also the people who didn't like Clinton might gravitate there too. So most research back in the 90s, that feels like it was a very long time ago, but it wasn't really, I suppose, in the big picture. Most research in those days was done on these Usenet discussion forums or bulletin boards. And what I did for my research was I actually said that we need to look at these questions such as design and at the way the discussion forums are institutionalized. And so I compared the political communication on a Usenet discussion forum with a European Union discussion forum. So this was a forum called Futurum, and it was to debate the future of the European Union. And I compared using a model of deliberation in this case, the nature of the communication. And what I found was that the EU forum was more interactive, and also that the debates were of a higher quality. So people used evidence to support their claims, and they didn't engage in negative discursive behaviors or perceived negative behaviors, at least in terms of deliberation, such as swearing and that kind of thing. And that was very different to the Usenet space. So what I argued at the end of that was the difference between the debate on Usenet and on the EU forum was explained, at least in part, by the way in which the interface was designed and structured.
Mm-hmm. And also, as you pointed out, moderation played a pretty key role there, right?
Yeah. For me, moderation is crucial to online debate. Back in the day, and it's even now, you still get a lot of people who come to this from a more libertarian perspective, who kind of argue that we need literal free speech on the internet. That Margolis and Resnick, in their classic work, Politics as Usual, talk about this quite extensively. That we have a civic, or not necessarily civic commons, but we have a commons, an open commons in cyberspace, as it was known back then. And what I've argued and what other people have argued is that actually, because many online spaces have anonymity, they have people dropping in and dropping out of forums, that you need an element of moderation to control what goes on. So I would argue that, following Stephen Coleman, that free speech without regulation, particularly online this is, free speech without regulation becomes just noise. And he goes on to argue that, it just descends into the most obsessive poster, the one who can post a lot and who rant the most. So for me, moderation is crucial. And moderation works in different ways. It can be censorship. It can be to say this person has sworn, so we will delete their post. Or they have said something that's anti-Semitic or racist or whatever, we would delete that post. But it can also be more progressive than that. It can be an active moderation, whereby the moderators participate as commentators themselves, and they can encourage good behavior, they can set the tone, they can interact rather than just being censors. So in some of my work, I've looked at different models of moderation and found that this more, proactive moderation is better in terms of the quality of debate that is produced.
Now, this is very interesting in light of our previous episode, which was on a platform called Gab that allows users to, it basically puts the moderation control into the hands of the user so they can self-censor words that they don't want to see, for example. What kind of effect do you think that has, where kind of meeting this maybe liberal individualist idea of complete free expression, even if it's inflammatory? How do you think when you allow users or citizens to self-moderate or to self-censor, do you think that increases the quality of debate?
I think any good moderation system has to be engaged, or has to engage with, rather. So any good moderation system has to engage with their users. It has to be transparent, and it has to be open and reactive. So good moderation systems, whether it be like that system or one where it's open to, maybe you can send an email in or whatever to the moderators, they don't get to do it themselves. It has to work with the users. If they don't, it just gets into a battle between the moderators and the users, and people will leave, or it can just descend into a bit of a mess. So I think all good moderation systems have to, whether it is by allowing people to do their own moderation, or allowing them to give feedback and add input to the design of the moderation system, they have to have that. They have to listen. The worst kind of moderation is silent moderation, whereby the moderators just delete things and they don't explain what's going on. It just upsets everyone. So moderation, I think, is hugely important for positive reasons, but a badly applied moderation policy is equally disastrous often. And I think, there's empirical research being done on that has shown both that moderation can have a positive effect, but actually in some cases it can also have a negative effect too if it's done badly.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting things that you're looking at in your research is this idea of the super participants. And so these are highly active people who kind of set the tone of discussion on these forums. And in a sense, they kind of do a collective moderation of the norms of that space. Can you talk about the super participants and their role in guiding deliberation?
Absolutely. So the super participants, we developed, myself and Todd Graham, a three-part typology. So three categories of super participants. The first one is what we call super posters. So the super posters are the ones that create a lot of content. They make a lot of posts in a discussion forum or a Facebook group or whatever. For our purposes, we say that anyone who's created more than 2,000 posts in a large forum is a super participant. So that was SP1s, or super participant 1. The second one, the super participant 2, is the agenda setters. Now, the second category is literally interested in those people that start new threads and set the agenda by deciding what topics people talk about. And again, we say, well, that is anyone who's created more than 100 threads. Now, of course, you might create a thread, but not many people could reply to those threads. So that wouldn't necessarily be setting the agenda. So we have to consider the extent to which people actually engage with those topics. And the third part of the model is the moderators, or the facilitators, as we also call them. So that kind of active moderation, we call it facilitation. So the third part is the moderators and facilitators that we were just talking about. And what we argue is that across these three categories or types of participants, that they, by posting on certain topics and using certain languages, or by the processes of censorship or active moderation, they set the tone, or the norms, as you called it earlier. They set the normative kind of structure of the debate, and that's crucial. For example, what some forums have done in the past is that they will have people that go in and post to set the tone. And what we find is that if the tone is set in a certain way, it tends to maintain itself. And that's why moderation is important, because if things start to degrade into, say, a trolling fest or a flame war, it's very hard to get out of that cycle. And that's why we think that the super participants are really important. Another thing I'll just say on that is the SP1s, those super posters, the ones that create a lot of content, they often get a bad reputation. I mean, in terms of deliberative democracy that we started off with, some people would argue that we need to have literal discursive equality. So everyone must speak equally within a debate for it to qualify as a deliberative democratic debate. I disagree with that. I would argue that everyone has to have the equal chance to participate, rather than literal equality in terms of participation. And what we found is that these super posters, they work well. They actually post positive comments. They hardly ever engage in negative behavior, such as trolling, in the forums that we've analysed. And there's some evidence from newspaper forums and other spaces as well to back that up too.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. You relate the concept of the super participants, or you base the concept off this idea of the regulars, right? So we can literally think of, regulars at a bar or a coffee shop or whatever, and they kind of set the environment, right? If you have a rowdy group of regulars, the people who go to that establishment are going to probably engage in a higher level of, if there's maybe a more antagonistic debate, if that's what the regulars do, and they can kind of set the parameters of expectations of how people are to act in that space.
Yeah. So what I've argued in some of my work is we have these online forums, these non-political online forums. That might be a parenting forum or a sports forum or a cooking forum, whatever, as long as it's not principally about politics. These forums can be what I call third spaces. So they are a non-political forum, but where political talk emerges. So political talk emerges through those day-to-day debates in a third space. This concept is built on Ray Oldenburg's classic book on third places, which are literally pubs, cafes, and so on. Basically, he argues is where community comes together for everyday political talk. He says that they're crucial to the foundations of, in his case, American democracy, foreground kind of citizenship and all of that. And what I've done is used Oldenburg's theoretical definition of a third place and re-theorized that for these online forums. So I've turned it from a third place, a geographical pub or whatever it might be, into a third space, an online community where people can come from, say, around Australia or even around the world, come together and talk about political issues. But the primary reason for being there, rather, is not actually politics. I argue that is really important, because if people go there to talk about parenting, they're not going there because they are from the left or from the right. And so when they do talk about politics, the talk is often cross-cutting. It's literally people from different perspectives discussing those issues. And they're typically very respectful of each other as well. So I think the kind of like third space really ties a lot of this work together, from the moderation, the super participants and all of that, because in the third space, the key, or one of the keys, is those regulars as you described them. As Oldenburg describes the regulars down the pub as being crucial to a third place, pub. You all can think of pubs that you go in and you've got the regulars and they're welcoming, they invite you in, and they have a chat with you, they're inclusive. It's exactly the same with these online forums. These regulars, super participants, as I call them, they actually are part of what makes it a community. And community is crucial to everyday political talk, particularly online.
So I understand when you have different, thematic forums, parenting or gardening, and political talk might arise out of that. How do you classify Facebook then? Is that a third space? Because it's kind of there's a lot of politics and news that are going across Facebook, but there's also tons of other stuff, right? Entertainment, maintaining relationships with friends. So how do you classify Facebook then and other social media?
I think it's a great question. It's a difficult question to answer. Essentially, the difficult part is, where do you draw the boundaries of a third space? Parenting forums might have a section that's focused specifically on politics. Gardening forum or whatever it might be, they might have a politics section. Now, I've just argued that one of the things that makes third spaces so good is that if people are going there not to talk, they're going there and politics can emerge everywhere. They can't avoid it as easily. If you kind of say, there's politics over there, I just won't go there. It's harder to avoid. But also you get then this cross-cutting political talk, the left and the right. So when you've got a politics sub-forum on a gardening forum or whatever, is that still a third space? We believe, we haven't empirically analysed this yet, but we believe that it does have an effect. It does water down some of those the theoretical underpinnings that we believe will make the debate on third spaces of a higher quality. And the same applies to Facebook. Facebook obviously can have groups, communities, as I would have called them in forum language, but in Facebook language, they have their groups and their pages, and people can go there and talk about, one of the ones that I'm involved with down here in Australia as a British person is Poms in Oz. So literally for British people in Australia or in Victoria, in the state where I live, and people go there and they have big debates, they ask questions, they get support, people talk about politics, visas is a classic topic right now for us in Australia for expats, access to visas and becoming permanent residents and all of that. You can imagine that with similar to like the Trumpian discourses. So I would argue that Poms in Oz is a third space. So what you can't say is that Facebook as a whole is a third space, but within Facebook as a platform, there are lots and lots of third spaces. So going back to Habermas, into that kind of like the classical theory, Habermas started off originally with this idea that there was this one monolithic general or big public sphere. And in his later thinking, he turned to argue that there was a constellation of public spheres, lots and lots of micro public spheres. And the internet was one of those spaces where you get lots of mini public spheres or micro public spheres. And that's how I would say Facebook works as well, really. Facebook has lots of kind of micro level public spheres. And I think that's really important and can be really high quality, and they can be third spaces. Go on, sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and it goes back to the aspect of design that we were talking about. I mean, I think we've all seen that Facebook has taken a real push towards groups and community pages. I know I get notifications all the time that are pretty meaningless because they're about comments that are in different groups that I'm in. So I think there is this definite argument to be made that those conscious decisions to shape the design of Facebook and fracture it into different types of public pages, timelines, news feeds, these are all different spaces within the kind of broader framework that is Facebook.
Absolutely, absolutely. And they keep redesigning. They're constantly working on their interfaces. Recently they've just announced that you can contact your elected representatives in America, and they're going to have basically an ability that you can identify, or they can identify, whether or not you're a local resident. So they've kind of got like micro level tools. When I say micro, I mean state level or district level tools that enable them to speak to their local constituencies and vice versa, to encourage debate with people's parliamentarians or elected representatives. These kinds of things are really potentially really, really important. It's not necessarily a third space, but it is a way in which everyday political talk is connected to the strong public sphere or the formal public sphere of power, of decision making, of parliament, of the presidency. So, when we have these things, and I'm really interested in everyday political talk. And I think everyday political talk is crucially important. It helps to set public opinion. It helps to create citizenship, build trust, and all these other values and important things. But it also, at some level, has to have a way of feeding into, or sluicing into, as Habermas called it, into power, into decision making. And that's where I think Facebook, through its design choices, both having, as you say, these groups, the news feed and all of that, but then also what they're doing in terms of their public advocacy type work is really important. And of course, a big elephant in the room in this debate is the way that fake news circulated on platforms such as Facebook and Twitter. So we're seeing design as being a kind of constant process, the way in which the algorithm works. And I would argue an algorithm is another part of interface design because it shapes what we see. Algorithms they're constantly being developed, iterated, tested. Yeah, I think it's a fascinating time, and Facebook has made lots of good steps. Obviously, there's constant work to do, and I think the interesting thing for me is with Zuckerberg's recent manifesto, if you want to call it that, for the kind of like global public sphere, global citizenship. He's obviously deeply invested in this personally. I think he was probably, in some ways, I say burned, but upset by the fake news and all of that. He sees Facebook as being a force for good. Whether or not it is obviously a very, very big question, and it gets down to what you might call the privatization of the public sphere. Facebook is, it's an amazing platform with billions now of people engaging, and we have the Poms in Victoria community that I engage in. It's great. It's really, really nice. You get to meet all these different people with a shared interest. So it's a great platform. But it is also a huge global brand, and we see all these concerns around the moderation of content on Facebook, banning photos of breastfeeding or whatever it might be. And they're in a very difficult situation. If you're a global platform moderating global debates, censoring at some level global debates, how do they know what is acceptable in Victoria versus Shanghai versus Washington DC versus Paris and so on and so forth? So it's a great time, and there's I think lots of great stuff being done by Facebook, but it's also a difficult time, and it's an area in which we continue, and the platforms in general need to continue innovating, and obviously they are doing that.
Right. And, this brings up a lot of issues. We've talked about the design of a platform, market forces, the kind of need for these platforms to bend to drive revenue. We've talked about the role of the super participants in setting the norms and also guiding the discussion, perhaps also circulating fake news in some cases. But there's also a key factor, which is how governments decide to regulate these platforms. And this brings me to the question of China, which I know you've done some research on in terms of their online space, because, free speech, or, to some degree, is a key factor in deliberation. And in China, you have a more state-controlled, top-down regulation of political talk that's going on these platforms. So can you talk a little bit about, first, the social media landscape of China and how that government regulation or oversight might make it different or not from the West?
Yeah, it's a great point. And this gets to, I think, the heart of the debate around free speech versus regulation. So I obviously argue that we need at some level regulation, be it active moderation or whatever, of political communication and generally communication on the internet. But who gets to decide what is acceptable political talk? And that, as I started to intimate with the previous question, it's a deeply sensitive issue. Breastfeeding photos being banned on Facebook. Is it up to Facebook to decide what is acceptable political talk? Now, at one level, it definitely is. But can we be comfortable with that? Maybe we are with Facebook. Maybe some people are. Maybe they trust Facebook, and trust is crucial to this. But what about if we're in an authoritarian context? You mentioned China. Do we trust the moderators in Chinese spaces to be censoring purely based on taste, decency, swear words, etc., or would they delete criticism, or would they delete all political organizing and all of that? So it gets back to a classic Latin phrase, which I hope I'm pronouncing it correctly, but quis custodiet ipsos custodes. Who will guard the guards? So if we've got these people moderating free speech, do we trust them? And that can happen at a group level, on a Facebook group or in a discussion forum, on a platform level, where Facebook and Twitter will moderate content at the platform level. And then it happens at the national or state or national level, whereby governments and other agencies will intervene to regulate the online public sphere. We've seen Germany requiring Facebook to take down fascist content, I think it was. We've seen similar things in other countries. So if we look at moderation in China, there's a worry in China over who is regulating the internet. We obviously have heard of things like the Great Firewall of China. Facebook isn't legally available in China, for example. People may access it through a VPN or a virtual private network, but most people can't access Facebook in China. There's also extensive platform level moderation. So if you want to participate on, say, Chinese Twitter, which is called Sina Weibo or Weibo, there's extensive moderation of those platforms. Same with the discussion forums. Whether it be a political forum or a parenting forum, all of these forums are moderated. And the moderation structure in China comes from above. So the government kind of sets the regulatory environment for that. And they want, it requires that platforms extensively moderate political talk. What research has shown, so there's been research done by Gary King and his colleagues at Harvard, and what they've shown is that censors in China are deleting comments that are about organizing political participation, so protest. If you try and organize, even if it's organizing in favor of the government or the party, they will delete that kind of content. If you criticize the party, typically that content is left. It doesn't get deleted. So what their research shows is that the Chinese regime or the party are interested in controlling activism, but not necessarily censoring free speech itself. And I guess that's because they want to know or understand what people are unhappy about. They kind of see this as a censor in the sense of a little measure of public opinion.
So it's interesting that they might actually be using social media as a sort of tool in order to echo or to kind of collect the disagreement about their regime and maybe incorporate other measures that address those issues.
Yeah. If you're in in an authoritarian state, it can be, it might be difficult to kind of complain. You might be worried if you kind of say, oh, I hate the government, or I hate this specific thing that's happening at my school, or with healthcare or housing policy or whatever it is. It can be hard to complain because you might be worried about what will happen to you in response. But the internet provides or has provided a space in which people could kind of complain, and it was allowed up to a point in China, for example. But what's happened in more recent years, if you look at the history of kind of like the regulation of the internet in China, it's gone through waves. It had an element of freedom, and kind of like we felt like, the genie was out of the bottle, really, that the internet, think back to 2011 and 12, even into 2013. Sina Weibo was this kind of public space where people were engaging in criticism of the regime and all of that. And what's happened is that the government kind of like actually managed to put the genie back in the bottle to an extent. It had a crackdown on the big Vs, as they're called, the super users, the ones with lots of followers on Sina Weibo, the celebrities. So it basically arrested some of the big Vs who were engaging in political talk, and it applied heavier censorship to Sina Weibo more generally. And alongside that, the big change was that it was successful in moving debate from, or some debate, a lot of debate from Sina Weibo, a public sphere, similar to Twitter, to a private messaging app called WeChat, which is similar to WhatsApp. So they've managed to now, or most people now use WeChat. WeChat is a huge platform in China, but most of it is private or semi-private, rather than being by default open in the way that microblogging is.
Yeah, and we talk about those dark social networks in a previous episode, so you guys can go and check that out. So China is a super interesting case. We're going to explore that a bit further in the podcast. But before I let you go, I want to ask about, because I know we have some listeners down under, is there anything kind of online or social media wise that's particular about Australia that we might not have in Europe or the US?
I would say, honestly, not specifically Australian-focused stuff. No, we in Australia, we are big users of those global platforms. We often use the same platforms. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and so on are hugely popular here too. But I guess what we do have is that these platforms get mediated and remediated, I guess redesigned in a way at the national and regional and local level. So people within Australia use it in different ways. They reflect as it happens, I'm sure, in other countries, it reflects your national environment. We have, for example, some amazing indigenous spaces online. Indigenous X is a Twitter handle that is used. It moves from week to week to different indigenous people, and it's a way to get indigenous voices heard. So we have this kind of online indigenous public sphere, which is absolutely fascinating, and it's brilliant. It's great, and we have these, I guess, these different kinds of public spheres, multicultural public spheres that reflect Australia as it is. It's a highly multicultural place. More than, I think, around 50% of the people who live in Melbourne, the city where I live, were born abroad. It's hugely multicultural. And our internet reflects that. The only other big thing that I would say about the internet in Australia is, famously, it is really bad. We have really slow internet here, and that creates lots of issues for people. So we have this thing called the National Broadband Network, and it's become a huge political football. But apart from our notoriously slow internet, I think we generally are becoming, and we are already, and we continue to develop into the kind of like internet citizens. And when you've got so many expats, people who are Australian citizens but were born abroad, half 30-40% of the country, up to 50% of the country in some cities are born internationally. The internet becomes a key medium for families to stay in touch. And that's what you see with like Ponds in Victoria. It's actually a way to make that kind of localization. It's real here.
Well, it seems that the Wi-Fi has held up good enough for this conversation. But is there do they have a problem where if too many people get on that it might crash? Is that how does it get overloaded, for example?
No, it's just our general speeds. Our general internet speeds are slow compared to like international. We have adverts on television, kind of like saying, we're like number 50th in the world in terms of our internet speed or whatever it is, and we're below random countries that we should really be higher than. We do have a policy for the National Broadband Network here, but it's become a political football between the different governments as to how it works in terms of whether we have a complete fibre network or a partial fibre network. And of course, Australia is a massive geographical country. Probably of the 24 million, I think it is now, 20 to 24 million people who live here, way more than half live in the major cities. But there's also these huge remote rural areas, the bush, the outback, where people live. And it's hard to get these areas connected. And so the digital divide is a really important thing here. We have satellite broadband and things like that to help with that. But it's more about just the general slowness of the internet.
Interesting. Well, Dr. Wright, thanks so much for taking the time out.
It's my pleasure, Michael. It's been great speaking to you.
I've just been speaking with Dr. Scott Wright, Senior Lecturer in Media and Communication at the University of Melbourne. You can follow him on Twitter at Scott_Wright1. I'll put that in the show notes. And thanks again for tuning in to another episode of the Social Media and Politics Podcast. If you've been tuning in regularly to the show, please leave us a review on Apple Podcasts and let us know how we're doing. And that's it for this episode. Plenty of more content coming your way. Subscribe on iTunes, stay informed, and keep downloading, keep listening, keep learning. I'm your host, Michael Becerra, signing off from Copenhagen. See you next time.